Today we are going to look at the different movements that happens in the shoulder joint. All right. I'm sorry guys, I was a little late to upload this video. It's because I moved to my village and here the network is like really bad. So and I was pretty much locked in my house like for 14 days. I'm still on day 5 or day 8 I guess. So yeah, things have been a little rough because of that. So I am in home quarantine for 14 days. Fingers crossed. Alright, so let's find out what are the different movements in the shoulder joint. Yeah, and before that, let's quickly look at the different planes of movement very quickly. Okay, so we know that we have three planes. Number one, frontal plane, the plane at which you're watching me right now. Number two is sagittal plane, which is basically the side view, right? Then you have the transverse plane, which is viewed from the top, right? Imagine you are on a helicopter and you are watching something from the top. So that is your transverse plane. So anytime you get confused with this, think about like as a personal trainer, how would you observe a client? So let's say I am doing bicep curls, right? Obviously you'll be standing in front of me, but which position or which angle will help you spot the mistakes more effectively? So you'll be obviously watching from the side if someone is doing bicep curls, right? So any type of flexion, extension, all of these things happen in the sagittal plane, which is the side view. So right, when you do a squat and you are videotaping yourself, you generally go for the side view, right? Why is that? Because that is flexion and extension again. So any kind of flexion, extension, hip extension, all of these happen in the sagittal plane. Frontal plane, basically your abduction, right? Abduction, adduction, all of these things happen in the frontal plane. Then you have the transverse plane, which is viewed from the top. So obviously you will not be going on the top and looking at a client, like that would be really weird. But yeah, in exam, if they ask you in which movement happens in the transverse plane, you should know, right? So any kind of internal rotation, external rotation, any kind of rotation where your bone is rotating about an axis, right? That is usually viewed from the top. So that is called the transverse plane. So internal rotation, external rotation, horizontal abduction, adduction. You know, horizontal would be when I'm lying down and I'm doing a bench press. So it's usually convenient to look from the top than from the frontal plane or the side view, right? When somebody is doing a push-up, you stand behind them and you try to give them support, right? So you're watching from the top. So that is the transverse plane. So that is happening. That is called horizontal abduction, adduction. So these are all about planes. Just think about the view, the angle at which you will look at a client. That will give you a little bit of idea like which movements generally occur in which plane, right? So we have the frontal plane, we have the sagittal plane, and we have the transverse plane from the top. Done. Now let's move on. So what are the movements in the shoulder? We know that the shoulder is a very complicated joint. It has wide range of movement. It is the most mobile joint in the entire body, right? And very close to it probably is your hip joint, because it also has the same variety of movements. Anyways, so for your shoulder joint, what are the movements? Let's look at it. Okay, so first we have the abduction. This is called abduction. So how do you remember that? You're abducting somebody, right? You're kidnapping, you're taking somebody away. So that is abduct, that is abduction. So for simplicity's sake, we will call it abduction. Okay, so your arms are being taken away from your body, right? So this is abduction or abduction. And what is adduction or adduction? It is the opposite. You're bringing it close. So you're crossing the midline. You see all these movements where you cross your hands like this. So that is adduction. So from 0 you're going inside, right? And abduction would be from 0 you're going outside. So this is abduction, this is adduction. And obviously you can guess that it will be happening in the frontal plane, right? You'll be watching it from the front. So this is abduction, adduction. This is two movements that happens in the shoulder. What else? You have shoulder flexion, right? So this is the shoulder joint and this is flexion. Notice how I had to turn to the side in order to show you, rather than showing you like this. Showing you like this is more easy for me, right? Because you will be able to watch this movement better when you're watching me from the side. So you can very well guess that flexion and extension happens in the sagittal plane, which is your side view, right? So what is the other movement for the shoulder? Flexion, extension. Then you have the elbow flexion, elbow extension, right? Abduction, adduction. What else we have? We have internal rotation, external rotation, right? So that happens again in the transverse plane. You'll be watching it from the top. So just as we saw abduction and adduction, that same thing can happen lying down, right? Horizontal. So when I'm lying down, like your classic example is your bench press, right? So I'm lying on a bench and I'm doing the same thing. So what is this? This is horizontal abduction. I'm taking my arms away from my body. So I'm abducting it, I'm kidnapping it, right? So this is abduction or abduction, but horizontal. This is horizontal abduction. So if I'm bringing it back, what is it? It is horizontal adduction, horizontal adduction. Okay, yeah. So I'm sweating a lot. I think I should switch on the fan. Okay, so that is horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, right? What else? Then we have movements in the scapula. We'll talk about that later. But before that, let's just quickly recap. So what are the movements in the shoulder? Abduction, adduction, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Then we have flexion, flexion, extension, elbow flexion, elbow extension. What else do we have? So then we have internal rotation, external rotation. So these are the basic movements of the shoulder: abduction, adduction, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, finally internal rotation, external rotation, right? So we have covered 8 movements. Now we have more, don't worry. So now let's move to the scapula. Let's see what are the movements of the scapula. So what is your scapula? This basically this bone that you see over here, which brings your shoulder blades together. So this bone, this is your scapula. So what are the movements in the scapula? In your scapula there are 6 movements, I guess. Yes, 6. One is, what is this? This is scapular elevation. Then you have the depression. This is called scapular depression. Then you have the scapular protraction, right? So from here I'm protracting my scapula. I'm taking my shoulder blades away from each other, right? So that is protraction. I'm taking my shoulder blades away from each other. Then we have the retraction. So retraction would be squeezing your shoulder blades together. Right now I'm bringing my shoulder blades together. We often give the cue of, imagine there's a lemon in between your shoulder blades and you're trying to squeeze that lemon, right? So that is called retraction. So scapula has elevation, depression, protraction, retraction. Then we have the upward rotation of the scapula. The scapula is moving upward like this, just like this. This is the scapula, it is moving upward like this every time you take your hands up. So upward rotation of scapula. Similarly, we'll have downward rotation of scapula. So when you're bringing your hands down, you're rotating that scapula downwards. So will you remember this? It's very simple. If you're moving your hands up, it is called upward rotation of the scapula. If you're bringing your hands down, it is downward rotation of the scapula. Now why am I emphasizing this? Why am I repeatedly saying this? Because in exam you might get a question like, when you are doing a pull-up, right? So at the top of your pull-up, what happens to your scapula? Is it downwardly rotating or is it upwardly rotating? Now at this point you might get confused. Maybe you're writing the exam and you're a little nervous and your mind might go blank, right? That's the reason I'm telling you to remember like this. Hands up is upward rotation. Hands down is downward rotation of the scapula. So no matter how they ask the question in the exam, you should be able to remember, right? Okay, at the top of the pull-up, what am I doing? Where are my hands? My hands are down. So obviously that is downward rotation of the scapula. But when my hands are going up, which is probably the beginning of the pull-up, right? Or let's say a lat pull down. So when my hands are up, your scapula is rotating up. So during a lat pull down, every time my hand comes down, I am downwardly rotating my scapula. Every time my hand goes up, I am upwardly rotating my scapula. Will you remember that? Done. So these were all the movements in the shoulder. I know that's a lot, but what to do? Shoulder joint is very complicated. So let's do a quick recap. Now you try to say with me when I say, so that it repeatedly when you say this, it will go inside your mind. So what are the movements of the scapula of the shoulder joint? We have abduction or abduction. We have adduction or adduction. We have horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. Then we have internal rotation, external rotation, right? Asking for lift. This is external rotation. What else do you have? We have flexion, extension, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, right? Obviously we also have elbow flexion and elbow extension, but that is different. For shoulders we'll mostly talk about flexion, shoulder flexion and shoulder extension, internal and external. So I think 8 movements, right? Abduction, adduction, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, that's 4. Then we have internal rotation, external rotation, that's 6. Then finally we have shoulder flexion, shoulder extension. So that is 8, total 8 movements. Then we have 6 movements in the scapula, namely elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, upward rotation of the scapula, downward rotation of the scapula, right? 6 movements in the scapula. So that's it. This much if you can remember, that's more than enough. You have understood the movements of the shoulder. What are all the movements that can happen in the shoulder? You have understood, especially the technical names of it. Okay, so big thing lifted off. Now let's quickly look at the muscles that are related to all of this. Now if you haven't already watched my basic human anatomy video about the shoulders, make sure you watch it. I'll also put a link in the description. In that I explain more about the muscles, especially shoulder joint muscle and shoulder girdle muscle, and what is the difference between the two. If you know that, this part will be more easy for you to understand. Yeah, okay. Now let's look. We started with abduction, right? Abduction. So I'll only be talking about the main muscles that are involved. Obviously there will be a lot of other synergistic muscles also that will help you do the movement, but we'll talk about the main muscles. Okay, so when I am doing abduction, we already saw in the previous video that the first 15 degree of abduction is done by which muscle? Do you remember? It's your supraspinatus, right? Supraspinatus. That is your rotator cuff muscle, which is responsible for first 15 degree of shoulder abduction or abduction. And the remaining abduction is done by which muscle? Obviously your deltoid, right? And especially your mid deltoids. Your middle deltoids, this area, the sides of your shoulder, this is responsible for the remaining part of your abduction or abduction. That is the reason we often see bodybuilders, they'll be isolating over here, right? They'll not bring the hand all the way down. They will bring it half and then again they'll take it up, and they'll keep doing that. So why are they doing that? They're really trying to isolate this area, the side deltoid muscle, right? Because that is responsible for the abduction, especially once you cross the 15 degree. First 15 degrees is done by supraspinatus, remaining is done by your deltoids. So anytime if they ask you, like, if you are doing abduction, which muscle is involved, obviously you will say the deltoids. Deltoids are involved for shoulder abduction, and supraspinatus, of course, that is also responsible for abduction of the shoulders. Okay. What else is now? Next movement is adduction, right? Shoulder adduction. So which muscles are involved in shoulder adduction or adduction? As you can already see, my chest is getting involved, right, when I'm doing this. So you must understand that there are, apart from the subscapularis, which is the main muscle for internal rotation of the shoulder, which is the main rotator cuff muscle, which is responsible for the internal rotation of the shoulder, we also have muscles like the pecs, the pectoralis major, the pectoralis minor. Then we also have the latissimus dorsi. Believe it or not, even your lats are strong rotators of your shoulder, especially internal rotation. It helps a lot. So adduction, what is responsible for adduction? Your pecs, of course, your pectoralis major and your latissimus dorsi. That's right, you often see people doing this, right? When they do this, they feel a strong squeeze in the lats when you do this. So adduction is also performed by your latissimus dorsi. Okay, and how will you remember that? You know the lat pull down, right? Lat pull down, the name itself suggests the lats, the V-shaped lats. We do this lat pull down exercise and pull ups, all these things, right? So what do you think is happening at my hands? What is this? This is nothing but adduction, right? I am doing adduction. Every time just because my hands are bent doesn't mean it's any different. It is still the same. I'm still doing this, right? I'm still bringing my hands towards my midline, towards my body. So that is adduction. So adduction, pectoralis major, pecs, and also your latissimus dorsi. That V shape you have, latissimus dorsi, that is also responsible for adduction. Okay, we saw abduction, we saw adduction. Now let's discuss about horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. Which exercise can I give you as example? It's very easy. Think about your bent over deltoid fly that you do, this exercise that you do, right? You bent over like this and you do this exercise for your deltoids. So horizontal abduction is done by which muscle? Your deltoids, especially your posterior deltoids. The muscle, this whole thing is your deltoids, the back part of it, the posterior part of it. The posterior deltoids are responsible for horizontal abduction. Yes, horizontal abduction. Okay, for horizontal adduction, again it's your chest, right? That's the reason when you do a bench press, what is happening over here at the top of the bench press, not at the start, not at the end position, top position of a bench press, what is happening? Adduction is happening, right? Just because my hands are bent doesn't make any difference. It is still adduction, right? It's still horizontal adduction. So every time I'm doing a bench press, I'm bringing my hands closer, right? This is a bench press, especially if you do it with a dumbbell in a fly fashion, right? So this is horizontal adduction. So I will be using my chest, my pectoralis major for adduction, and to some extent my deltoids, especially my anterior part of my deltoids. I'll be using that for horizontal adduction. Okay, moving on. What's next? Flexion. Shoulder flexion, shoulder extension. Right, let's talk about flexion first. In shoulder flexion, which muscle are you using? Think about it. You know that pulley that we do for your chest, especially your upper chest. You hold the pulley down like this and you take it up. So what are you basically doing over there? You're doing shoulder flexion, right? So every time you're doing shoulder flexion, you're using what? Your pectoralis major, your chest muscles. So that is responsible for shoulder flexion. Will you remember that? Now there's one more muscle that you use for shoulder flexion. You know which is that? Of course, your anterior deltoids, but I'm not talking about deltoids. There's one more muscle which you use for shoulder flexion. Which is that? It's your biceps. I know that sounds absurd, right? I mean, we always know that biceps is for elbow flexion, right? But very few people know that biceps is also responsible for shoulder flexion. That's the reason you see all these gymnasts and all these calisthenics athletes, what they do is they'll take a resistance band and they'll keep doing this straight arm strength. So this also works their biceps. That's the reason all that pseudo planche push-ups that you see, that people are leaning and doing that push-ups, right? What is happening over there? Basically, although it is in an extended position, what you're trying to do is flexion, right? Just because there's a floor over here and the floor is not moving, I'm still trying to do flexion, right? Under resistance, I'm using the floor as a resistance. So this is shoulder flexion, and for that you are using your biceps. Whether you believe it or not, you are using your biceps for your shoulder flexion. You are using your chest muscles and you are using your anterior deltoids for shoulder flexion. Will you remember that? Alright. Moving on, what is the next one? Extension, shoulder extension. So which muscle is responsible for shoulder extension? By now you have probably already guessed it is your triceps. Obviously, to bring your hands back, see, automatically I can feel it in my triceps every time I do this. So shoulder extension, my triceps are responsible for shoulder extension. But there is also lot of other muscles that are responsible. Whether you know it or not, your latissimus dorsi is also responsible for shoulder extension. That's the reason, when your shoulder, when your hands are here. Very simple example. You know that straight bar push down that we do it for the lats, right? Why? What is happening over there? Think about it. See, this is a shoulder flexed position, right? So when I am doing a straight arm push down, what am I basically trying to do? I am trying to do a shoulder extension, right? Just because the bar stops over here at my thighs and I stop here, doesn't make any difference. I am still trying to do an extension under resistance, right? So every time I am doing a shoulder extension, I am using my latissimus dorsi. So this is how you will try to connect as a trainer, so that you can understand all the biomechanics. You should understand, now every time you do an exercise, try to think, which muscle am I activating and what movement am I doing? Is this shoulder flexion or is this shoulder extension? What is it? And which muscle am I using, right? So for shoulder extension, you will be using a latissimus dorsi, and you will be using a triceps, and you will also be using a posterior deltoids. You see, this movement that we do for the one arm rows is obviously for the lats. The same hand, if you bring it slightly here, so this is what? This is horizontal abduction, right? Horizontal abduction. I am not lying this way, but I am this way, and I am doing the same thing, right? So if you watch from here, I have a dumbbell in my hand and I am doing this. So what is this? This is shoulder extension, and I am isolating my posterior deltoids. So shoulder extension, your horizontal shoulder extension or horizontal shoulder abduction is carried out by your posterior deltoids. And if it is regular shoulder extension, it is done by my latissimus dorsi and my tricep muscles. Remember that. Okay. So then finally we have the elbow flexion and elbow extension. That is obvious, right? Elbow flexion, you will be using your biceps. Elbow extension, you will be using your triceps. This pretty much everybody knows. And did you notice how I had to turn like this to show you the biceps and the triceps? What does that tell you? That means elbow extension and elbow flexion and elbow extension happens in the sagittal view. Similarly, shoulder flexion and shoulder extension happens in the sagittal view, the side view. Similarly, hip flexion and hip extension also happens in the sagittal view. That's why when we do squats, we try to look sideways, right? Even deadlifts, we like to see the side view of it. So it's all happening in the sagittal plane. So I know I'm bombarding a lot of information into your head right now. So right now at this moment you might feel like, oh my god, this is so much information. I have to think about the muscles, I have to think about the plane of movement. Don't worry. Initially for everyone it is like that, but once you get familiar with these topics, or if you watch this video repeatedly, what will happen is a few points will sink deep inside your head. When that happens, then you will be able to connect everything. Right now when I say so many things together, it's difficult, but when a few things gets inside your head, like the concept of flexion, extension, horizontal abduction, adduction, when those concepts stick inside your head, then you'll be able to connect, and then you'll be able to understand, okay, when I am doing horizontal abduction or abduction, I am using my posterior deltoids, And then, every time I'm doing shoulder extension, I'm not only using my triceps, but I'm also using my latissimus dorsi. Similarly, when I'm doing adduction, I'm using my latissimus dorsi. That's why during a lat pull down, I feel it in my lats when I bring my hands here, right? Because this is nothing but shoulder adduction. So these things will sink in inside your head, don't worry. For internal rotation, we already know we have the subscapularis, we also have the pectoralis major, and we also have the latissimus dorsi. That is also responsible for internal rotation of your shoulders. And for external rotation, we have the infraspinatus and we have the supraspinatus. We already know that, right? Okay. And lastly, we'll look at the scapula. I know that will become too much. It has already become 25 minutes and you're probably overloaded right now. I know. I also thought that I'll keep this video short, but what to do, guys? I mean, the shoulder joint is really complicated, right? There's so much information to share. That's the reason this video is long, so bear with me. Okay, so lastly, we'll look at the scapula. So when you're doing scapular elevation, which muscles are you using? You're using the trapezius, obviously, the upper trap specifically, but you're also using your levator scapulae, which originates from the base of your skull all the way here. So this area. So you're using a levator scapulae and you're using the upper fibers of your trapezius muscle to do scapular elevation. For scapular depression, you're using the lower fibers of your trapezius, also called as lower traps, and you're also using your pec minor. See, I can already feel my chest when I'm depressing. I'm already feeling my chest, right? So your pec minor is also responsible for scapular depression. Okay, what else? Elevation done, depression done. Retraction is obviously your rhomboids. Your rhomboids are responsible for squeezing your shoulder blades together. Your rhomboid major and your rhomboid minor. For protraction, you will be using your serratus anterior. We know that the serratus anterior is called as the boxer's muscle or the fighter's muscle, because mostly in boxers, this muscle is very ripped and very prominent because they throw a lot of punches, right? So punches is nothing but protraction of the scapula. That's the reason this serratus anterior muscle is very ripped in such people. So serratus anterior is responsible for shoulder protraction. Also your chest is also helping a little bit for protraction, but main muscle is serratus anterior. Retraction, rhomboids. Elevation, upper traps and levator scapulae. Depression, pec minor and lower fibers of the trapezius, that is lower traps. Done. Upper movement of the scapula, your serratus anterior also helps in the upper rotation of the scapula. Lower rotation of the scapula, again your lower trapezius helps out. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Done. Finally you're done. And yeah, you can reach out to me on Instagram just by the name athlete.sanju, SANJU. You can type by that name and you can find out. I'll also put it down in the description. And I'm also giving all my notes in a simple PDF format at a very small price. So if you want that, you can message me on Instagram on that same, athlete.sanju. Thank you, guys.